What's up, guys? We're breaking down UFC Fight Night, Volkov versus Rozenstruik. And this card is still a couple weeks away, so dropping this episode a little earlier. And overall, the card's not too bad. It's your typical heavyweight main event and number of debuting fighters on the card as well, but not a bad card overall. Should be a fun one, honestly. Hopefully it stays intact because it looks like we already have a few fights fall off already. But yeah, without further ado, I do want to get into the recap of the previous event. Kind of run through that because it was a pretty rough event. But yeah, let's get right into it. So kicking off the card, we had Elise Reed, Sam Hughes. Definitely not a great way to start the night for me because, I was on the Reed side and I did go pretty heavy on the fight goes the distance prop. And obviously neither of those cashed, completely overestimated Reed's takedown defense, her get-ups, and even her cardio. Didn't think she'd just get absolutely bodied in the wrestling here. Ended up getting finished late, which, put me in a massive hole to start the night. And things don't get better here. Chase Hooper, Felipe Colares. Initially, I was on the Colares side, but, I looked into Colares' fights a little deeper. I did a little write-up on there as well. But, seeing him get, I wouldn't say ragdolled, but, seeing him get tossed around by, bigger, longer fighters like, Pilardi and even DeFreitas wasn't very encouraging for me. And him moving up a weight class, I think, would have been tough for him. So I ended up hedging out and putting a bit on Hooper as well. I ended up betting the over, thought that this fight would go the distance, but, we saw a late stoppage as well in this fight. The pressure and the pace of Hooper was just a little too much. I thought Colares would be able to hang in there, but, Hooper just completely outpaced him in that fight. But moving along, Jonathan Martinez, Vince Morales, had Martinez parlayed up, but, obviously the second leg of the parlay didn't cash, which we'll get to in a bit. But yeah, Martinez looked solid. Morales didn't really have anything on the feet for him. But moving along, we have another Morales, Omar Morales versus Uros Medic. I bet Medic here. The speed and, the power of Medic just a little too much for Morales, who is getting a little up there in age as well. But moving along, Gelton Almeida, Parker Porter. Didn't touch this fight. Wasn't really sure what was going to happen here, but Almeida made pretty quick work of Porter, which little surprised with. I thought Porter would be able to put up a little more resistance, but at the end of the day, Almeida's just a freak athlete who's quite skilled on the ground as well. But moving along, Joseph Holmes, Alan Amadovsky had the under parlayed for this fight. Obviously didn't really matter because one of the legs didn't cash. Also took a small poke on Amadovsky to win in round one, which historically is what he's done. I just saw a bit of value there. Wasn't super confident. Holmes was able to get the round one submission. Not surprised at that whatsoever, though. Moving along, Eric Anders, Jun Park. Took the fight goes the distance, and then also Park by decision. Value side was definitely Anders, though. It was a very, very close fight. Can't be too upset with the decision here. I don't think Anders was really doing too much. He went for that single on multiple occasions, but Park did a good job stuffing it, and I think was able to reverse positions at one point. So I just thought Park did enough to win there. Wouldn't have been too upset if it swung the other way, but I do think that Park, I do think they got it right here. Poliana, Viana, Tabitha Ricci. I bet Viana here. And, Viana being stuck on her back was a totally live outcome, and that was a concern I had. But yeah, not the greatest fight IQ from Viana, honestly. I feel like after that first round when that armbar didn't materialize, she should have just kept the fight standing where, she was doing work. I feel like she could have won that fight pretty easily. Like, she was doing a decent job of stuffing the takedowns, and she had plenty of opportunities to get the fight back up to the feet. And, that was such a winnable fight for Viana, but, just terrible, terrible fight IQ. Moving along, Chidi Njokwani versus Dusko Todorovic. And I did bet Njokwani in this spot, and it was kind of hairy early in the fight. The grappling was something that Todorovic is capable of doing, but, it's interesting, right? I thought he would have done that against, Punahele as well, but obviously he got starched in that fight. And then, of course, in this fight, the fight I do bet against him, and he attacks the grappling heavily. Fortunately, Chidi was able to find that elbow in the clinch and put him out. But, if that fight would have gotten extended, it probably wouldn't have been great for Chidi, honestly. But, glad to have cashed there. So we move on. Santiago Ponzinibbio versus Michel Pereira. Didn't bet a side here. I felt that it'd be a really close fight, which it ended up being. So I ended up just taking the overs. And, I kind of agree with the decision here. I thought Pereira won the first round pretty decisively. And I'd say he won most of the second round as well. Ponzinibbio kind of started to pick it up later in the fight, but I felt that Pereira had done enough to win on the cards there. But yeah, I did feel that this fight was going to go to decision. But yeah, moving along, Holly Holm, Caitlin Vieira. This one kind of stung because I think I was down about like 3.5, 4 units at this point. And, going into that fourth round, I thought that Holm was up. I felt pretty confident in my bets cashing and, being able to even out the night. But they ended up giving the decision to Vieira there, which, I don't know if I really agree with. Obviously there's going to be some bias here, but listening to the commentary and even Vieira's corner, it seemed like Holm was going to win this, 3-2 or maybe even 4-1, but apparently the judges saw it a little differently there. Really rough way to end the night because, I had Holm, had a decent-sized play on her. I had her tied up in a parlay as well. If that had cashed, we would have had not as big of a losing night. We would have actually, I think, finished in the green, honestly. But, it is what it is. We got to move along from these. Sometimes you get these fights that don't go your way, and sometimes you do. But, we just gotta move on and hopefully look to bounce back on an upcoming card. So, without further ado, let's get right into the breakdowns for this card. I think the order's probably not right just because I don't think they've officially announced the bout order yet. So I'm just going off of Tapology here. So we'll kick this card right off. And in the next fight, we have Tony Gravely versus Johnny Munoz, and Gravely's the -155 favorite. Comeback on Munoz is +135. And we'll start with Munoz first. So with Munoz, he is primarily a grappler. The stand-up isn't particularly great. He's, I think, a regional level striker at best currently. Like, I see him fighting very competitively with, lower level guys, even on the regional scene. But, he is pretty reliable to grapple and get fights into control positions, which is really where he shines. The guy is a very strong submission grappler. But, if he isn't able to get the fight to the ground, he is reliable to cage push, hold his opponents up against the cage. We saw that in the Menes fight where, he was hitting takedowns in that fight, but he was also cage pushing a lot in that fight. His wrestling, I don't think, is particularly great either. He's got a nice reactive double, and he will look to catch kicks and work the single as well. But overall, I don't think he's that great at hitting takedowns overall. That said, though, he is still pretty young, and, there is a chance that he is making improvements during the offseason and stuff. But, if he is able to get the fight to the ground, he does have really good jiu-jitsu there. He does have a good back take, will hunt the submissions, and is pretty good at controlling opponents as well. However, the caveat with that is, he's really not beaten anyone good. A lot of his wins are against lower-level guys. But outside of that, his cardio does seem all right. He has gone the distance in 3-round fights and 5-rounders while consistently mixing in the grappling. So I think that, he does have the cardio to sustain the game plan that he likes to implement in there. And he's going to be going up against Gravely, who is primarily a wrestler, but, he has developed his boxing quite a bit. He likes to pressure opponents on the feet. Nothing crazy, though. He does have some power in his hands, but, overall, he's not some, like, elite striker or anything, very meat and potatoes with the striking. But, he is very big, very strong, and very explosive with his striking and with his takedowns. He's got good timing on the level change, just capable of exploding into a takedown. And he has shown that he could hit, 5+ takedowns in a fight. However, the issue with this style is, one, he isn't the best at controlling opponents, which is why, he has to hit, multiple takedowns in a fight. And two, he does slow down in fights. His takedowns and his striking is just really taxing on the cardio, especially with the amount of energy he puts into it. So he is prone to gassing out as fights get extended and potentially getting finished as well. And, we saw him slow down a bit in the Menes fight where he did get knocked out. I think it was a mix of him, slowing down and also getting a bit sloppy. But, we see it a lot in his other fights earlier in his career as well, where, he's just not able to maintain that sort of pace. And usually it's against other grapplers. They're able to kind of just grind on him and kind of break him later in fights and submit him. And historically, that's kind of where he has struggled against good grapplers who have been able to kind of just grind on him and eventually find the submission. Now, this is an interesting matchup because, Munoz, he is a solid grappler, and I can see Munoz having success there. I'm not sure if Munoz is quite at the level of the guys that have been able to take Gravely down and submit him. The guys that have been able to do it are guys like, Brett Johns, Patchy Mix, Manny Bermudez, and Merab Dvalishvili. Merab didn't submit him, but he did win a decision over him. But these are, solid grapplers who have actually gone on to do stuff in their careers and, are doing really good for themselves currently. So, these are all legit guys. And, I don't know if Munoz is quite at that level, but I do think that he does bring a somewhat similar skill set to these guys. Munoz, I don't think his wrestling is that great, but I do think that, he can make this a very grindy, sloppy sort of fight. And, if that is the case, I can kind of still see Gravely slowing down in this fight and, potentially dropping the last 2 rounds or even getting submitted. I do like the boxing of Gravely a little bit more. Honestly, I think that the game plan for Gravely should just be to look to keep the fight standing and just look to box up Munoz, because I do think Gravely is the better boxer, slicker boxing combinations, and more power in general. So I think that should be the game plan, but I don't know if he's going to go to it. He is a wrestler by trade, and I can definitely see him, kind of maybe instinctually just shooting a blast double or something. But, with Munoz, while I don't think his wrestling is particularly great, he can make this a very grindy sort of fight, So I'm going to go with Munoz here. I think that Munoz, I think he's going to be able to get his grappling going, mix it in there. And I think Gravely's going to slow down to the point where he's going to drop the last 2 rounds or potentially get submitted later in the fight. So I'm going to go with Munoz here. I'm going to pick Munoz by round 3 submission. And I kind of do like this fight to go under just because I think that, Gravely, he is kind of dangerous early. The guy does have power and, he might be able to put Munoz out. But I do think that ultimately he will slow down, and I do think that Munoz will be able to find the submission. So I'm going to go with Munoz, official pick, and I'm going to pick him by round 3 submission. And in the next fight, we have Alonzo Menifield versus Askar Mozharov, and Menifield's the -140 favorite. Mozharov is the +120 underdog, and this should be a pretty fun fight for as long as it lasts. 2 big hitters going at it. But we'll start with the newcomer and underdog in Mozharov. So, not a ton of recent footage on Mozharov, but from what I have seen, the guy is a very fast starter. He's got some very heavy low leg kicks. We'll mix in, those flashy spinning attacks as well. That said, though, I feel like some of his finishes are a little suspect, though. Don't get me wrong. The guy does seem to have a lot of power. He does look like an absolute physical freak in there. But the fact of the matter is he's beating up on a lot of bums. A lot of these guys who probably have to go back to mopping floors the next day, and they feel his power and realize it's a little more than they bargained for. Some of his finishes are legit, but some of the ones he's gotten, from what I have seen, he's barely touching these guys, and they're kind of just flopping over, shelling up. So, I don't doubt that this guy hits big, but, against, I'd say, legit fighters, guys who are a bit tougher and able to put up a bit more resistance, I think are going to give Mozharov a lot of trouble. And I wasn't able to find footage on, his 2 recent losses, but they do seem like, decent opponents who are, solid, like, I guess, regional level guys. This Christian Torres guy, I think he did actually get matched up with a UFC level guy at one point. I'm blanking on the name, but I would guess that in these fights, they're able to kind of stand up to Mozharov a bit, take his shots, and actually return fire. The D'Souza fight, it looks like, he gets caught in a choke, so maybe the guy slows down as well. If you guys have links to these fights, please feel free to share it because I'd like to check them out. But my guess with this guy is, he's a bit of a bully, a bit of a physical freak, able to just dominate guys early in fights. But against guys who are able to stand up to him, he may be prone to wilt a little bit. And he's going to be going up against Menifield, who, at one point was kind of that guy as well. Just a big freak athlete with, very explosive striking. I don't think, the striking is particularly high level or anything, but the guy's just got some insane power to back it up. The cardio, I think, is pretty suspect from Menifield. Slows down pretty hard after that first round. And, depending on how hard he goes, he may even gas out after the 2.5-3 minute mark. But But taking a look at this matchup, I do think it's, pretty straightforward. I think someone's likely going to get knocked out early here. Both guys have, freakishly big power, and both have been finished before. So, it's not like these guys are just two like super durable guys who are able to hit big. They're both, kind of glass cannons who I think potentially may slow down in fights. However, overall, I definitely do have to favor Menifield just because he's, fought and knocked out UFC level guys. Whereas with Mozharov, he's knocking out a lot of guys on the regionals, but it's against a lot of bums, honestly. So for those reasons, I kind of have to lean Menifield just by a very thin margin. And I do think the odds are about right. You kind of have to favor Menifield just because, he's been in the UFC a little bit longer and he has shown that he's got knockout power at the UFC level. Whereas with Mozharov, it is a little bit of an unknown, but I do still think that, he's got the potential to knock Menifield out here as well, right? Because Menifield, he has shown that he can be hurt before. He has actually been knocked out. And, against someone like Mozharov, who, does like to start really aggressively, I think Mozharov definitely is live as well. But, so is Menifield. Menifield, a ton of his finishers have been early in fights as well. In Menifield, he has been fighting a little more composed lately. We saw that in the Herman fight and the Knight fight. But something that I do want to note, though, is, Herman and William Knight are pretty low-paced fighters. But I think that in this fight, Mozharov is probably going to be looking to press the action here. That's kind of how he fights. I don't see Mozharov coming in, trying to be really technical or anything. So I think that this fight's going to be a bit of a car crash early. Mozharov going to come forward. And I think that Menifield is going to oblige him. So I do like the under 1.5 in this fight. Gives that extra 2.5 minutes, if this fight somehow does get into the second round. But I do think that this fight likely ends in the first round. I think that Mozharov, he's going to come out guns blazing. He's going to land some, heavy leg kicks. Either he's going to fold Menifield in there, or Menifield, he's just going to bite down and land some big shots of his own. So as far as an official pick, I think I'm going to side with Menifield just purely on the basis of him having a few more UFC level wins, but, not super confident just because, if you look at the resume of Menifield, his best knockout win is actually, I think, Paul Craig, and the rest of his wins really aren't all that impressive because, Fabio Charant, Vinicius Moreira, not exactly, the best UFC level wins, but I'd say it's still better than some of the wins that Mozharov's picking up on the regionals. So give me Menifield by round 1 knockout, but I think the under is probably just the play here. And in the next fight, we have Joe Solecki versus Alex da Silva, and Solecki is the minus 215 favorite. Da Silva is the plus 180 underdog, and we'll start with the underdog in Da Silva. So with Da Silva, he is, I think, a pretty well-rounded fighter, a little wild on the feet, and, is a bit of a brawler, honestly. He does seem to have some power, pretty slick combinations. Does a decent job of mixing in the kicks as well. A nice front side kick that he likes to throw, and that oblique kick, which is a pretty controversial maneuver, but also very effective, if you are able to pull it off. But anyways, he can grapple as well. The wrestling seems okay, especially when he's fresh. But outside of that, he does kind of telegraph his shots a little later in fights. He's a pretty decent grappler, kind of strong, pretty heavy on top, does generally prioritize control. That said, though, I've noticed that a lot of his takedowns are happening against opponents that are, kind of off balance, him catching a kick or something and him kind of ending on top in scrambles. He did hit, I think, a nice, blast double against Riddell. But outside of that, it's kind of hard to really definitively say how good his wrestling actually is. He seems a little more opportunistic with the takedowns more than anything else. But moving along, he's going to be going up against Joe Solecki, who is primarily a grappler. Serviceable striking, nothing special. But I do think it kind of works for him just because, he's got the threat of the takedown. I don't think his striking is super high level or anything. He's got decent wrestling, a good body lock takedown. Does have some nice takedowns along the cage as well, which I do think constitutes most of his takedowns, though. But he is a good submission grappler, pretty good at controlling opponents and kind of just riding them out. But the issue with Solecki is, his takedown defense isn't particularly great. And, he is someone who will close his guard when he's on his back, which I really don't like seeing that. I think that's even worse than, the people who are, attacking submissions off their back, because at least when you're doing that, you could potentially catch your opponent with something. But, with Joe Solecki, he's kind of content to just close his guard and let the round end that way, which I think is just an absolute, disaster if, you get taken down, with 2 or more minutes on the clock. It's pretty much guaranteed you're going to drop the round unless you had a very dominant, first 2.5, 3 minutes. And with Solecki, I do think he slows down as well. But taking a look at this matchup, I think that we have two guys going at it with, pretty similar attributes. Both very physical fighters who are kind of front-loaded in their success in fights. Historically, a lot of these guys get most of their finishes earlier in fights. And, that first round is really where they perform their best. De Silva, I think, is the better striker. Solecki, he's a little better and more consistent with the wrestling and the grappling, in my opinion. But, I don't think he's levels or anything above De Silva. I do think that De Silva is a decent enough grappler to be able to hang with Solecki. And I think the same can kind of be said about the striking as well. While, I do favor Solecki or De Silva in the striking department, I don't think he's going to wash Solecki out or anything either. De Silva, I think has better takedown defense. And I do think he can match Solecki in terms of the physicality. So I can see De Silva stuffing takedowns and possibly even reversing positions along the cage and maybe even taking takedowns of his own. And, the big difference I think between the two is De Silva, obviously, better takedown defense and get-ups, whereas with Solecki, we saw in the Miller and the Gordon fight where he was taken down and he was kind of content to just close his guard and let Miller and Gordon finish the rounds on top, which I think is a big red flag, honestly. But overall, I do think that first round is going to be very important for both guys. I think, both guys, that's when they're at their best. And, both guys do slow down. So I kind of see this fight kind of being split 1-1, in the second and third round. And so I think that that first round is going to be, important to really bank. So for those reasons, I think this fight's actually going to be a lot closer than the fight should indicate here. I think it's honestly pretty close to a 50-50 fight. Maybe you edge Solecki a little bit, just because I think the guy's a bit more consistent of a wrestler and grappler. But I do think that De Silva is good enough in that department to have success of his own and potentially even stuff takedowns. And when it comes to the striking, I definitely have to favor De Silva a little bit more. He seems a lot more comfortable on the feet. He seems to have a bit more power as well. I think his striking is a little more dynamic as well. And, when it comes down to it, especially going down later in the fights when maybe they don't have enough or have enough energy to grapple and effectively grapple, I think the better striking from De Silva is going to pay off there. So overall, I feel this fight is actually pretty competitive. So for those reasons, I'm going to go with De Silva here, especially since he's a big underdog as well. But look, I just think that for Solecki to have success, he's going to have grappling success for 2+ rounds. And I just don't think he's going to be able to do that as easily as he did against, fighters like, Jim Miller or Matt Wyman, two guys who are a bit up there in age. Miller actually took the first round off of Solecki, and, Solecki was able to win just because Miller historically does slow down after that first round. And, with Wyman, older fighter, probably shouldn't have been in the UFC at that point. So yeah, I don't think that Solecki's gonna be able to dominate De Silva like he did those guys. In fact, I'd say this is a little closer to maybe the Jared Gordon fight. Granted, Jared Gordon is a veteran who is very scrappy, and I do think that De Silva kind of brings some similar attributes as well. So for this fight, I am gonna side with De Silva here. I don't think he should be this big of an underdog. I think this fight is honestly closer to 50-50, maybe like 55-45 for Solecki. So official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with De Silva here. I think De Silva gets it done by split decision. I think it's going to be a very close fight that can go either way. And I do kind of favor this fight to go the distance. Solecki might be able to find the submission. And I do think that if there is a finish, it's likely coming, from Solecki. De Silva, there was a bit of a red flag, right? He did get submitted by that guy. I'm blanking on his name, Russian dude. Not a great look, honestly, but, it was his UFC debut, and he was kind of young in that fight, so I give him a little bit of a pass. I think that it's something that, he could definitely, improve on. But overall, he is a plus 180 underdog, so I don't know if I have to make a crazy strong case for him. So yeah, I'm going to go with the Silva here. The Silva by unanimous or split decision. And moving along, we have Niklas Stolze versus Benoit Saint-Denis. And Saint-Denis is the minus 150 favorite. Comeback on Stolze is plus 130. And we'll start with the underdog in Stolze first. So with Stolze, he is a kickboxer. Nothing special, though. His UFC run has been, I'd say, pretty lackluster, if I'm being honest. But even regionally, I wasn't really impressed with what I've seen. Lots of singular strikes from him. He's kind of plotty. I guess he's got a nice jab and a decent kicking game. But, overall, I just haven't really been all that impressed with what I've seen from him. And he's going up against Saint-Denis, who is, primarily a grappler. The striking is very unpolished from Saint-Denis. He's out there just winging bombs on the feet, absolutely zero footwork whatsoever. I see in a lot of his fights, he's just chasing his opponents around the cage. Pretty comical, if I'm being honest. But defensively, he's very hittable. We saw that obviously in his UFC debut against Zaleski. But, even outside of that, on the regionals, he does leave his chin on a platter for opponents to hit. That said, though, he is very tough. He will move forward, and he is very explosive, whether, it's with the striking or with his, takedowns. He's someone who's going to look to kind of just punch his way into the clinch, get his hand on his opponents and just rip them to the ground. The grappling seems pretty solid from him. That said, though, it does seem like he relies quite a bit on his athleticism to get fights to the ground and to, kind of outmuscle his opponents into a submission or a ground and pound victory. But taking a look at this matchup, it's kind of a weird one because, I really don't think either guy's particularly great. I think that overall maybe Saint-Denis got a little more upside, because he is pretty young and he is still pretty early in his career. And I do think that, he might be reliable to hit takedowns and get his grappling going. That said, though, I don't think he's a particularly great wrestler. And Stolze, he does seem to have, I guess, decent takedown defense. Evloev was able to get a ton of control time off on him, but, that's kind of what Evloev does. I don't think Saint-Denis is that sort of fighter. And I don't know how much stock you really want to put into this, but I think Stolze is actually a brown belt, whereas Saint-Denis is a purple belt. So, I don't know if Saint-Denis is going to be able to just dominate Stolze on the mat like he has against a number of his regional opponents. And on the feet, I kind of do favor Stolze quite a bit more. I just think he's the more technical striker. I think he's just much more comfortable there. Whereas with Saint-Denis, he leaves his chin up in the air. The guy's got, non-existent footwork. And offensively, he's kind of just throwing just big, heavy shots there and, not really setting anything up. So I feel that with Saint-Denis, his best path to victory is to, hit takedowns, maybe find the submission or just get enough control time to win a decision here. But I don't know if I see that happening, because with Saint-Denis, it's not like he's some high-paced wrestler who's going to repeatedly look for takedowns, chain takedowns together or anything. He's just more of a grappler who, he can kind of muscle opponents to the ground. So I think that if Stolze is able to work his way back up, stuff some takedowns later in the fight, I can see him start to have a bit more success with the striking and be able to kind of just tee off on Saint-Denis as the fight progresses. So for those reasons, I think I'm going to go and pick Stolze here. I might even bet him, slight plus money. I don't know if there's a ton of value here just because overall, I'm not really all that sold on Stolze, but I do think that there is a path to victory here for him against someone in Saint-Denis who I think, his game is still ultimately very green. And, his path to victory, I think, is, kind of narrow as well. So the pick for me in this fight is going to be Stolze. Stolze probably by decision. I don't know if he's going to be able to finish Saint-Denis. Zaleski wasn't able to, and he put an absolute beating on him. Granted, that fight probably could have been stopped, but Stolze's not even close to the level of striker that Zaleski is. And overall, I kind of do favor this fight to go the distance. I think most of the finishing equities probably going to be tied up with, Saint-Denis. I think if anything, he might be able to get Stolze down on the mat and just submit him, but I don't think that's going to happen here. I think Stolze's defensive grappling and submission defense should hold up here. I do think that this fight likely sees the scorecard. So, give me Stolze here. Give me Stolze by decision. And moving along, we have Mike Trizano versus Lucas Almeida. And Trizano's the minus 230 favorite. Almeida is the plus 195 underdog. And we'll start with the underdog and debuting fighter in Almeida first. So with Almeida, he does appear to be a really aggressive, high-paced striker. Likes to move forward and just put crazy combinations together. Seems to have some power as well. But, of course, the issue with his style is he does slow down. And the sort of pace that he puts really isn't all that sustainable. We saw it in the Dana White's Contender Series fight where, he had a very strong first round, but tapered off pretty hard afterwards. He wasn't completely gassed out or anything, but, his striking was much more labored and he just got way more hittable afterwards. And outside of that, he has shown a lot of early finishes. Does have a couple of finishes in the third and fifth round, but those were against guys who weren't putting up too much resistance or really threatening much, and it's going to be a much different fight against someone who is able to get off some of their own effective offense, because I think in at least one of those fights I saw, his opponent really was just trying to hang on to a single most of the fight, trying to get the fight to the ground, and really wasn't doing much in terms of landing his own damage against Almeida. And in this fight, I do expect Trizano to be able to get some of his own offense off. And, with Trizano, he is a decent boxer, does a decent job of fighting well behind the jab, a nice low kick as well. But outside of that, he is somewhat one-dimensional in that regard, somewhat low output and is kind of a coaster, right? The guy doesn't really put much of a pace on his opponents, and, he doesn't seem to have a ton of power either. And on top of that, Trizano does seem to struggle a bit with the takedowns as well. I think in pretty much all of his fights outside of the Dawodu one, his opponents have been able to have, some degree of success taking him down and holding him down. But, I don't know if that's going to be too big of a factor with this matchup here. Almeida largely is a striker. I've seen him hit some takedowns on the regionals, but I don't think that's a major part of his game. However, another issue that I have with Trizano's game is he just really struggles to put a stamp in fights, right? The guy doesn't have a ton of power, and he doesn't really have the volume to make up for it. Historically, he's been in some really, really close fights, 2 split decision wins early in his career, or early in his UFC career, and, win over Ludovic Klein, which, a lot of people thought he lost. But personally, I thought he won that fight. Klein really wasn't doing much with the takedowns, whereas, Trizano, I think, was landing just the way more effective strikes. Regardless, the point is, Trizano, he's in really close fights a lot of the time. But, taking a look at this matchup here, I do think that Trizano should be able to edge it. Despite being in all these close fights, he's the more proven UFC level fighter. He's shown he could go 3 rounds, against UFC level competition. Whereas, with Almeida, he hasn't really quite shown that yet. But as far as the dynamics of this matchup, I can kind of see Almeida starting strong like he usually does. And, I could see him maybe winning this first round. I don't know if he's going to knock Trizano out. Trizano's pretty tough. He was eating some bombs from Dawodu, and I think Dawodu's a much, much better striker than Almeida. So, I think Almeida probably starts strong, takes that first round, but, tapers off like we saw in the Contender Series fight, and we start to see Trizano start to pick it up. Come that second and third round, I think Trizano is just going to be able to land at will against an Almeida who's going to start slowing down. He's going to be much more plotty and much more hittable come that second and third round. So the pick for me is going to be Trizano. Trizano likely by decision, just because Trizano, he doesn't really put his gas on the pedal. He's just content to kind of coast through rounds a lot of the time, and I can kind of see him doing that in that second and third round. Plus, Almeida, while he does slow down, he's not someone that completely gasses out, right? He does still do a decent job of moving forward and throwing strikes, so I can kind of just see him hanging in there. But yeah, I do favor Trizano to win here. Not extremely confident, and where the line is set right now, I feel it's about right. I do think that Trizano should win this fight at a relatively high clip, but I definitely have concerns on the Trizano side. One being him not putting stamps on rounds, right? I think he should win the second and third round, but there's a chance he drops that second round because, Almeida might still have a bit left in the tank, and, he might just steal the round based off of, aggression and pressure. And, maybe Almeida is able to hit a takedown and that could swing the round as well. But overall, I got to favor Trizano being the much more proven fighter at the UFC level. And also, this is going to be, I think, a decent step down in competition for Trizano. Like, I think this is a big step down in competition compared to Dawodu. And, even compared to his Ludovic Klein fight, this is, I think, still a bit of a step down in competition. So I do think this is potentially a big bounce back spot for Trizano. And, despite everything I've said about him not really putting his stamp on fights, he's kind of had some, poor stylistic matchups, against guys who have been able to wrestle and grapple him and make things really close. But, I don't know if Almeida has quite that upside. So I do think that in a largely striking affair, we could potentially see Trizano put on a statement performance, which is why I'm a little torn with what to do with Trizano here, because I do really like him in this spot, but I do feel the line is about right. I don't know if there's a ton of value there, but ultimately I do think he wins this fight. Not sure what quite to do yet, but I think I might parlay him or just play him by decision. Haven't decided yet, but the official pick for this fight is going to be Trizano by decision. And in the next fight, we have Erin Blanchfield versus JJ Aldrich, and Blanchfield is the minus 450 favorite. Comeback on Aldrich is plus 350. And we'll start with the big favorite in Blanchfield first. So Blanchfield looking like a very promising young prospect, very good grappler, very good wrestler as well, coming off of a very dominant performance over Miranda Maverick, who is another very promising young prospect as well. But, from what I have seen with Blanchfield, she does seem to have pretty good takedowns, pretty good grappling. She's got a wide variety of takedowns I've seen her hit. I've seen her hit some like trips, throws, single leg takedowns, good high crotch as well, and, lateral drop. Just very impressed with the overall variety of takedowns I've seen her hit in, on the regionals and in the UFC. On top, she does seem like a pretty proficient grappler, really slick in transitions, good top game as well. I guess the only criticism I really have is just maybe she's not the most active, but she's really good at controlling her opponents. I know, you can look at the Alpar fight where she just completely mauled Alpar on the ground, but I think that's a bit more of an anomaly performance. A lot of times she's, just working on, advancing positions and, controlling her opponent on the mat. And overall, she's actually fought some pretty good fighters as well, even on the regionals. Obviously, in the UFC, she's coming off of a win against Maverick. But even regionally, she fought, Cortez, took her to a split, and Kay Hansen as well. I know people are pretty low on Hansen, but, Hansen is, I think, a legit, regional level fighter, and she was able to beat her. But she's going to be going up against Aldrich, who is, I think, a pretty underrated fighter. She's primarily a boxer. She's got good footwork in volume, decent takedown defense and defensive grappling. We saw that come into play in her most recent fight against Robertson. And I'd say the best trait, honestly, for Aldrich is probably her fight IQ. She's actually kind of savvy in the octagon. I've listened to some of her interviews, and she does seem to have a bit of understanding of stylistic dynamics and stuff. And her game plan does change from fight to fight, depending on the opponent. I remember distinctly the Barber and the Robertson fight. So, in the Barber fight, she mentioned that Barber does seem to struggle with pressure, and she did start off that fight pretty aggressively, but at the end of the day, it just wasn't quite enough. Physicality of Barber took over. Barber decided to just bite down and move forward and just land bombs on her. So, obviously fight IQ, not the end all be all, but I think it does show that she kind of understands the game, and she does know what she needs to do to win fights, even if it sometimes doesn't work out. And we kind of saw it too in the Robertson fight where, she did a really good job of maintaining distance in that fight, not overcommitting to her shots. She was really just pumping out the jab, working the 1-2, nothing too crazy, just keeping it simple and really just focusing on stuffing the takedowns of Robertson. And, she did work that fight, but also, she did a good job of closing out rounds with her own takedowns as well, which I think does a good job of really scoring on the cards there. So, yeah, I think that Aldrich, she's shown some good fight savvy in the octagon there. But unfortunately, it just seems that she doesn't quite have the athleticism to back it up. But for this matchup, it's going to be, I think, a pretty tough fight for Aldrich. I definitely favor Blanchfield. I like her skill set. I think it's very conducive to winning fights. She's very reliable and persistent with her takedowns. She's got a wide variety of takedowns, and she just knows what her win condition is. It's to get the fight to the ground, and she does a really good job of consistently doing that. And overall, I just feel the margins and the path to victory for Aldrich is pretty thin. Like, she's gonna have to repeatedly stuff takedowns from Aldrich, and if she's taken down, she's gonna have to work her way back up to the feet. She's gonna have to fight a very similar game plan and fight like she did against Robertson, which I think is actually going to be a lot more difficult to replicate that here. For one, I think that Blanchfield is just a much better striker. Robertson is pretty much a non-factor on the feet, and I think that Aldrich was able to keep it really basic on the feet and still win the striking exchanges. And on top of that, I think that Blanchfield is just a much better wrestler than Robertson. Blanchfield will chain together takedowns. She will relentlessly pursue the takedowns, whereas with Robertson, she's kind of just one and done in there. If you stuff her first takedown, she's just going to back off and then strike a little bit. So I don't think Robertson does as good of a job setting up her takedowns either. So I just think that when it comes to the wrestling and the grappling, I just think that Blanchfield is a bit better there. And lastly, I think that Blanchfield is going to be the more physical fighter as well. Little bit of MMA math here, kind of. We saw Blanchfield and Robertson both get matched up with Maverick, and Robertson basically just got ragdolled by Maverick for most of the fight. Wasn't able to get any of her offense going, whereas Blanchfield was able to kind of throw Maverick around in there. So I just think that in terms of the grappling and the physicality, I think that Blanchfield is much better. So I think that Blanchfield should be able to hit takedowns here and get enough control time to win. That said, though, the line definitely does seem kind of wide here. Like, at minus 450, you kind of have to guarantee that Blanchfield is going to repeatedly hit takedowns and get enough control time to win, 2 of the 3 rounds, which I'm pretty confident she should be able to, but, it's hard to find much value in that line, honestly. And even though I think that Blanchfield is a better wrestler and grappler than Robertson, it doesn't necessarily mean that she'll have more success or a ton more success, right? I still think that Aldrich can keep this fight pretty competitive, right? I definitely don't think that Aldrich is going to look like a plus 350 underdog in there. So, I might end up putting a small bet on Aldrich by decision. I do think that Blanchfield should win this fight, but I think that Aldrich has a chance here. She hasn't really gone up against a ton of grapplers, and going into this camp and her previous camp, she's probably been drilling her takedown defense and her get-ups. And I do want to mention, in some of Blanchfield's older fights, she has gone to a split on a number of occasions just because, against better opponents with better defensive grappling, they've been able to kind of stuff some of her takedowns and, do enough work on the feet to neutralize some of the work she's done, with the control time and the wrestling and grappling. So I do like Blanchfield in this spot, but I do feel the line is kind of wide. I do think this fight likely goes to a decision. Neither fighter, I think, is a very potent finisher, especially at the UFC level. And I do think both should be good enough defensively to stay alive and make it to the decision. But official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Blanchfield. Blanchfield by unanimous decision. And moving along, we have Rinat Fakhretdinov versus Andreas Michailidis. And Fakhretdinov is the minus 280 favorite. Comeback on Michailidis is plus 240. And we'll start with the big favorite, also making his UFC debut in Fakhretdinov first. So not a ton of recent footage on this guy, outside of the Spicely fight where, he absolutely starts Spicely early. You'd have to go all the way back to, I think, 2016 to find some of his fights. And that was a very weird fight itself, right? He was taking his opponent down repeatedly and just kept getting stood up, right? I don't know what the ref was thinking there, but at one point, he actually took the back of his opponent and the ref decided to still stand him up. So pretty horrendous reffing in that fight. But as far as what Rinat brings to the table, he does seem to be more of a wrestler, grappler type. He's a bit plotty on the feet, does seem to have a bit of power, but, in a lot of his fights, at least the older fights, he's looking to take his opponents down, kind of secure position, lay a bit of ground and pound. But overall, I can't say I'm overly impressed just because, he's fought a lot of very low-level guys. It does seem like he's got a solid skill set, something that, he can have a lot of success with. But up until about 3 fights ago, he was largely just beating up on debuting fighters and, just 1-1 fighters. So I got a lot of questions about this guy. Maybe he is at this level, but it's kind of hard to tell because he's largely just crushing cans. But yeah, he's going to be going up against Michailidis, who, he's had a few UFC fights, but really hasn't shown much in them, if I'm being honest. In the Pereira fight, was able to get a bit of cage control time, but then just get blasted by a flying knee come that second round. And, he had that very weird TKO stoppage against Bukauskas where, they opened up the cage and he kind of just lost his balance and they ended up calling off the fight. And then he had a very, just uneventful striking affair with KB Buhler, who is a terrible fighter, honestly. But with Michailidis, he does seem to be a bit of a just plotty pressure fighter, likes to blitz in and just throw big looping combinations. Supposedly the guy is a black belt and, he has shown a bit of wrestling. He was actually able to hold Pereira up against the cage for a significant amount of time in that first fight, or in his most recent fight, I should say. But even on the regionals, he has shown that he could hit some takedowns. Not like a major part of his game, but it is something that I do think he's capable of doing. But for this fight, I kind of wanted to see how this guy's takedown defense holds up, but, wasn't really able to find too much footage. I think he's fought just a ton of strikers, even on the regionals. There were a few fights where I guess he showed a bit of takedown defense along the cage, did show some scrambling ability, but, it's not very extensive and it's really hard to get a good read on just based off of, those few exchanges. But from what I have seen, Michailidis does seem to be pretty physical in there. And, he is a pretty scrappy fighter as well. But taking a look at this matchup, I'm just not sure if Fakhretdinov should be this big of a favorite. I think it's a pretty big step up in competition for Fakhretdinov here. And on top of that, I think there's like kind of limited footage on both guys. So it's hard to be like super confident on Fakhretdinov, but as far as the striking, I kind of have to favor Michailidis, actually. Wrestling, I definitely favor Fakhretdinov. The guy is, very consistent with it. The guy is really aggressive with it as well. But on the other hand, Michailidis has shown that he could wrestle a bit. And, as far as the grappling goes, he might even be the better grappler. I'm not saying he is, but potentially he might. Level of competition, I still have to favor Michailidis over the regional competition over Fakhretdinov. I think even on the regionals, Michailidis, he's faced some decent guys in I think Vladimir, Menifield, and a few other guys as well, right? Whereas with Fakhretdinov, his last 3 fights, against better competition, but prior to that, it's super weak. I mean, the guy's record is extremely padded. And if you're giving Michailidis the same guys, he's probably going to be able to get the same results as well. Overall, I just feel that Fakhretdinov has way too many unanswered questions to be this big of a favorite. Outside of that, to be this big of a favorite, I feel he'd have to have a pretty big edge in most areas of the fight. So in this fight, I really only give him a massive edge maybe in the wrestling. But, as far as the striking goes, I think Michailidis is probably superior there. And on top of that, Michailidis might be able to hit takedowns as well. And we really haven't seen Fakhretdinov on his back. And if Michailidis is able to put him on his back, who knows how he's going to look. In addition to that, Fakhretdinov, a lot of early finishes as well. So, who knows how he's going to look against someone who's going to be able to put up resistance, come that second and third round. So just far too many red flags to be this big of a favorite. And I mean, how are you going to make this guy a bigger favorite than Alex Pereira over Michailidis? So I'll probably be making a small bet on Michailidis here. I think I'll still pick Rinat to win just because, I do think that his wrestling could give Michailidis a lot of trouble, especially if he's able to put him on his back. But I just don't think he should be this big of a favorite, so I'll probably just end up putting a bet on the underdog here. But as far as the over-unders, I kind of favor this fight to go under, actually, because if I'm picking Rinat, I kind of expect him to just be able to pound Michailidis out. Michailidis has actually been finished in a number of his fights. I don't think the guy's super durable or anything. So I think if Fakhretdinov is able to get Michailidis down and get into a dominant position, he could just start raining down ground and pound and get Michailidis out of there. But overall, I do feel that most of the finishing upside is probably with Fakhretdinov. I don't really see Michailidis getting a finish here unless he catches Fakhretdinov with something big, but Fakhretdinov is pretty durable, never been finished. So, I'd be a little surprised if Michailidis was able to bomb him out of there. But as far as an official pick for this fight, I do still have to go with Fakhretdinov here. I'm going to go with Fakhretdinov I think I'm going to go round 3 knockout. Because now that I'm thinking about it, there was this fight that Michailidis was in. They're pushing a pretty crazy pace, but, Michailidis was completely gassed in that 3rd round. And the ref basically just had to call off the fight just because Michailidis was turtling up and really wasn't doing anything else. And, his opponent wasn't even landing heavy ground and pound or anything. He was just throwing some, pitter-patter shots. But Michailidis was basically just turtled up and had nothing left. So the fight got called off. And if the cardio of Fakhretdinov does hold up in this fight, I could definitely see him getting a late stoppage as well. So official pick for me is going to be Fakhretdinov round 3 knockout. I might even bet that for a little, but I'm probably going to bet Michailidis as well, just because I do think that he can make this fight competitive. But if he gasses out, he definitely can get stopped in the 3rd round as well. But official pick Fakhretdinov round 3 knockout. And moving along, we have Osbourne versus Zarrukh Adashev, and Osbourne's the minus 155 favorite. Adashev is the plus 135 underdog. And we'll start with the slight underdog in Adashev. So with Adashev, he is a kickboxer, a little undersized in there, but he is pretty quick. Likes to blitz in with combinations. But in a lot of the fights that I've seen, he does like to stay on the outside as well and just throw kicks. Was able to just chew up the leg of Benoit in his most recent fight. Adashev, he is pretty quick on the counter as well. Pretty decent timing on it. But ultimately, I do still feel he's a bit undersized for the division, and he has struggled a bit with Ranger strikers like Mudarji and to an extent Tyson Nam. But it's really hard to say because that fight ended really, really soon. That said, though, after rewatching the Mudarji fight, it actually, in my opinion, played out a lot closer than I had remembered it being. Outside of that knockdown, obviously, in the 2nd round, Mudarji actually wasn't getting a ton of effective offense off. He was kind of limited to just throwing that side kick and, pumping the jab out a bit. It was more than enough to get the job done. Adashev really struggled getting inside with his own offense, but, it wasn't like a complete blowout or anything. Adashev was landing a few strikes, but, outside of that big moment in the 2nd round, I felt it was a competitive-ish fight. And, I can see this being a similar dynamic in this fight as well, because Osbourne, he is primarily a striker, has shown a bit of well-roundedness. He's wrestled and grappled a little bit, has a number of submission wins earlier in his career, but recently he's kind of preferred to strike a little bit more. But O'Day, he does like to stay on the outside. A bit of a counterpuncher, good power, good timing. Was able to actually land some pretty nice counters on Kopp. Pretty quick hands also, was touching up Vergara as well. So overall, he's a solid striker who has shown he could wrestle and grapple a little bit. But taking a look at this matchup, I think the striking might actually be a little closer than what people may think here. I still got to favor O'Day, just because he's the taller, longer guy. But I do think that Adashev might have some success with the low leg kicks. O'Day does stand a little heavy on that leg. And overall, I just kind of see this being a bit of a slower-paced fight because both guys, I think, are somewhat counter-heavy in their striking approach. So, it'll be interesting to see who is going to lead in terms of some of these exchanges. But overall, I do have to slightly edge O'Day because he's got a few more tools on the feet and, is a little more dynamic in his striking. And he's just going to be the taller, longer guy. So I could see him just kind of staying behind the jab and the kicks, although O'Day isn't really that sort of fighter. So it'll be kind of interesting to see how this fight plays out. But overall, I do still have to favor O'Day a tad bit, just for all the measurables and stuff. And on top of that, O'Day is, I'd say, a little more well-rounded. Adashev, he is primarily just a kickboxer, whereas with O'Day, we have seen him hit some takedowns before. He does seem to have a pretty sneaky submission game as well. So I think that, he does have, some grappling upside if he does decide to get the fight there. And on top of that, he's going to be the much bigger fighter. And if he does decide to take it there, he could just be a little more physical as well. So for those reasons, I got to go with O'Day here. I think he gets it done by decision probably. Adashev, he is decent defensively, and he does actually fight somewhat conservatively. He has been knocked out before, and he has been dropped. So I do feel if there's any sort of finish happening, it's probably going to be Adashev that's getting finished. I don't think Adashev's like a big hitter or anything. So I don't think he's going to get Osbourne out of there. I think, if anything, Ode might land something big. Clip Adashev, knock him out, or even submit him. We haven't seen too much of Ode's submission game at the UFC level, but on the regionals and on the Contender Series, he was looking for the sub. So I do think that finish may be live for Ode, but I do kind of favor this fight to go the distance. Adashev, he does fight pretty conservatively and like to stay on the outside. So unless Ode is able to land something big, I don't see him being able to get Adashev out of there. But I wouldn't be surprised if he does. But official pick for this fight, I'm going to go with Ode here. Ode by decision. And moving along, we have Jeff Molina versus Zhalgas Zhumagulov, and Molina is the minus 155 favorite. Zhumagulov is the plus 135 underdog, and this should be a pretty fun fight to watch. We have two high volume, pressure strikers going at it, but we'll start with the slight favorite in Molina. So with Molina, again, very fun fighter to watch. The guy's an action fighter. Likes to move forward and throw volume. Very good diversity in his striking. I think he can fight pretty well out of both stances. Does a really good job of just feinting and mixing up his strikes. Overall, just a very dynamic striker. I feel he's someone that's kind of tough to deal with on the feet. He gives those opponents a lot of things to process because, he's giving them a lot of looks, a lot of feints, but he's also throwing a ton of volume as well. So it's really hard for opponents, I think, to really get into a rhythm against him. I guess the only criticism I have so far with Molina is, one, the competition isn't particularly strong, but, he's looked pretty good in most of his wins or UFC wins so far. But, he's got, I'd say, subpar takedown defense, and I do think that overall he lacks a bit of physicality. I don't think he's the strongest guy in there. But to counter some of that, he does make up for it with his volume and his pressure. And in regards to his takedown defense, it's kind of bad, but he does do a really good job of working his way back up. He's very slippery in scrambles, and generally he doesn't really accept bottom position. That said, though, I don't know if that's going to be too big of an issue here. We've seen a little bit of wrestling from Zhumagulov, but it's not really his strong suit. Zhumagulov is more of a striker himself. Decent volume coming from him. Has had a pretty solid regional career. He's got good combination punching, decent counter punching as well. Does get a little wild, and, he is someone who does like to load up big, blitz in with big winging hooks as well. And something I've kind of noticed as far as, his UFC run is that, a lot of his strikes have actually come up a bit short. And I feel that it might be a result of him, kind of aging a little bit, and maybe his game isn't as suitable for him now that he's, slowed down a little bit, lost a bit of his explosiveness that he had, earlier in his career on the regional scene. But at 33 years old, I wouldn't say he's particularly old or washed or anything, but at the flyweight division, I do think that he's definitely on the older end of the spectrum, and I do think in the grand scheme of things, he's, I'd say, on a downtrend as opposed to, Molina, who I think is going to be entering the prime of his career. That said, though, Zhumagulov is going to be the way more experienced fighter. The guy's had a pretty tough strength of schedule, even on the regionals, and coming into the UFC, he's fought some pretty solid guys as well. However, overall, I'd say he's had a pretty disappointing UFC run. I think he's kind of struggled with getting backed up in a lot of his fights and taken down as well. He's taken down a lot in the regionals as well. He's pretty active off his back, but it just really doesn't look all that good when you're on your back. The one time he was able to aggressively move forward, he got knocked out by a cop. But anyways, taking a look at this matchup, it's a pretty interesting fight because I think both guys have pretty solid cardio and output. I kind of like Molina a little bit more, but I definitely do think that Zhumagulov will be able to keep up in terms of the output and the pace that Molina's going to be able to put out. By the numbers, if you're just looking at the stats, Molina throws more, but those stats I think are definitely inflated by his last two fights. I think that this fight might play out a little more similarly to his Contender Series fight against Silva, Because if you look at the Arichi Lang fight, I think Arichi Lang kind of gassed out after that second round. Not terribly or anything, but he became just way more hittable after that first round and a half, and Molina was able to just basically get his offense off at will. And for this fight, he's going to be fighting a much better fighter in Zhumagulov, so I think Zhumagulov is going to be able to kind of hang in there, but I do still favor Molina to kind of take over, come that second and third round. And Molina, he is someone that tends to start a bit slow in fights, not ridiculously slow, not like Chito Vera or anything, but he is someone that builds into fights. He is someone who, going into that second and third round, he will start to up his volume and basically just go downhill from there. So I kind of expect to see that happen a bit in this fight. Overall, I see the length and the kicks and the feints of Molina giving Zhumagulov a bit of trouble. I think he's going to do a good job of, just drown out the big loopy strikes of Zhumagulov. And I think he'll probably be able to see a lot of him coming. So, I don't know if Zhumagulov's going to be catching him flush with a lot of those big shots. I think Molina is probably going to be able to roll and parry a lot of these shots as well. But the concern I have for Molina, obviously, I think the physicality could be a bit of an issue. Overall, I'm just not really sold on the power of Molina, and I just think that when it comes to them exchanging in the pocket, Zhumagulov might just be landing some of the bigger shots, but I kind of see Molina being able to pepper him up a little bit more. So the official pick for me in this fight is going to be Jeff Molina. I think he's going to be able to edge a pretty close competitive decision, and I do think that this fight likely goes the distance as well. It is a flyweight fight for one, and I don't think either guy's particularly big finisher. Zhumagulov, he is coming off of a knockout loss, so you do have to wonder a little bit, if his chin is still intact, but Molina isn't the biggest hitter himself, so I like this fight to go the distance, and I like Molina to be able to edge it here. So the pick is Molina by 29-28 decision. And in the next fight, we have Karine Silva versus Poliana Botelho, and we'll start with the slight favorite and the UFC debutant in Silva first. So with Silva, she is a very aggressive fighter offensively, just throwing a ton of heat, standing. But from what I have seen, it does look like she does prefer to grapple. In case you weren't able to tell, in some of her photos, she's built like just your typical wrestler, very thick on top. And, she is someone who will explode into her takedowns, very aggressive on top with the ground and pound, and will hunt the submissions very aggressively as well. So just a very vicious fighter on top. But something that I definitely think has to be noted here is the level of competition. She's running through some very, very low-level fighters that I don't think have any sort of grappling credentials. I think her best one is probably that Chinese chick over on the Contender Series, and that was a fight she was losing, by the way. She was taking down that fight. Gave up a lot of control time. Had some ground and pound getting rained down on her, and was able to actually catch her opponent in a guillotine in that second round, but it really wasn't looking good up until that point. And, she was starting to gas out pretty hard. So I feel that if that fight would have been extended, it wouldn't have been great for her. But outside of that, she really hasn't beaten anyone of note either. Like, who's her best win outside of that? Maybe a 44-year-old City Roca or a 36-year-old Simone de Silva, who is also a 17-21 pro boxer. So, not the highest level of competition. The loss is very suspect as well. A loss to a 2-0 fighter and a 3-0 fighter at the time. So, a lot of red flags on the Silva side. But, offensively, she does look good. She does seem very physical in there, very strong, and she does seem to have a proficient grappling game. It's just that it's really hard to gauge just how good she is because of the level of competition. And, she's going to be going up against Botelho, who really not much to write home about either. Botelho primarily a striker, somewhat flat-footed, but does seem to have decent power. Kind of low output, though. And, she does seem to have a decent kicking game, but overall, I don't think that she's looked really all that good at the UFC level. But, at least she's fighting, decent UFC level competition and hasn't looked like terrible or anything. Historically, she has kind of struggled with grapplers. Calvillo was able to sub her. Robertson was able to take her down and kind of just dominate her in the grappling. But again, this is against, proven UFC level fighters. And we just don't know if that's the case with Silva just yet. But taking a look at this matchup, I kind of do have to favor Silva stylistically just because I do think that Botelho is pretty weak against grapplers. I think that Silva should be able to hit takedowns and maybe get the submission or at least get enough top control time to maybe win on the cards. But, it's really hard to say just because Silva, she's got a ton of early finishes and historically hasn't really looked good in fights she's extended in. And the fact that she's still pretty early in her career, you have to wonder how she's going to look if she isn't able to pound Botelho out in that first round and a half, And, Botelho, I think, is going to be the much better striker. So if Silva does start to slow down, I could definitely see the striking of Botelho start to take over. She might even be able to get like a late knockout as well. So while I do kind of favor Silva stylistically, I just think that she's a little too green and a little too front-loaded in her win condition to confidently pick her in this spot. But I'll still go with her just because I really don't think that Botelho is that good of a fighter. I'm just concerned, honestly, with how Silva's going to look beyond that first round. With these fighters who are making their debuts, who have historically run through their competition, they tend to go a little too hard early. So I think that there's a chance Silva maybe just unloads the tank early and ends up gassing out and not having much left come that second and third round, in which case it'll get pretty hairy. But I'll still go with her to win. Over-unders, I feel like this fight, might be slightly juiced to the over just because it's a women's fight, but I do think that there's a chance that we see a finish here. Silva obviously can get the finish early, but if she doesn't, she might just gas out and we see Botelho start pouring it on her late for a late finish as well. So, obviously you can't be too confident in a women's fight to go under, but I do think if there was a women's fight to go under, it'd probably be this one just because Silva is a bit of a kill or be killed fighter. So I'll go with Silva here to win in round one. I'm at very low confidence just because, Botelho, we did actually see her survive to a decision against Robertson, and I'm not sure if Silva is at that level of submission grappling. So, it's kind of hard to say. This is a very weird fight, but I'll go with Silva here. And moving along, we have Dan Ige versus Movsar Evloev, and Evloev is the minus 255 favorite. Comeback on Ige is plus 215. And we'll start with the underdog and Ige. So Ige, he's a very solid, well-rounded fighter. I believe his base is in jiu-jitsu, and he is a black belt, but I think he does prefer to stand and strike now. His boxing is solid, decent power and output, good combination and pressure striking. On top of that, he has shown he could hit takedowns as well. So Ige, he's just a tough guy who's able to move forward, and he does have good cardio and has shown just an overall very well-rounded game. So a lot of things to like about Ige, but the thing with him is I just think that he's got a very clear ceiling in this division. He's a decent athlete, but he's just not quite dangerous or elite anywhere to really be a legitimate contender. And I know he is ranked, I think 10 or something right now, but I think that's a result of some favorable matchmaking, and he's been fighting a lot of ranked guys, but overall I feel he's kind of overachieved relative to his ranking. And, I think he might lose his ranking in about a year and a half time when he gets matched up with guys below him. But he's going to be matched up with Evloev, who I think is a legit top 10, top 5 talent potentially. Maybe not right now, but I do think he's got a lot of potential. So with Evloev, his game is pretty straightforward. He's a wrestler, really likes to just spam takedowns, hold his opponents down, is really aggressive with it, really consistent with it. He's reliable to hit, 5, 6, 7 plus takedowns in a fight. And, he's tough. He's got the cardio to pull it off as well. And, I do think his striking is improving as well. He was able to outstrike the likes of Barzola, Grundy, and even Nick Lentz. Not the best names on there, but, he is slowly working his way up, up the ladder here. And I do like the progression that he's shown. Obviously, I think he's still going to struggle against, legit strikers like Choi and Dawodu. But, even in the Dawodu fight, I felt he was keeping it competitive enough for him to set up the wrestling. And, he did get hurt a bit in that fight, but he did show some good recovery and inability to kind of stall the fight out when he did get hurt. And overall, I still feel that Evloev hasn't even hit his prime yet. But, he's got a very solid base to work with in his wrestling. And I do think that's going to be able to win him a lot of fights going forward, even if he doesn't improve his striking, which I do think his striking will continue to improve. I think he's been looking pretty solid there lately. But taking a look at this matchup, I definitely have to side with Evloev here. I just think his wrestling is going to be a bit too much for Ige here. His ability to just chain together takedowns, I think, might be a little too much for Ige to handle. I think that we'll see Evloev hit 5+ takedowns and get 9-10 minutes of control time and just win I think a pretty clear decision. Ige historically has kind of struggled with good wrestler and grapplers. His takedown defense I think is pretty subpar. We saw the Korean Zombie and Bektic have a decent amount of success taking him down and holding him down. Obviously I don't think that Evloev is quite as good of a grappler as these guys, but I do think he's a much better wrestler. Bektic and Korean Zombie are, legit black belts, but, I think Evloev is a much more proficient wrestler. And, even if Ige is able to consistently work his way back up, I think that Evloev is going to be able to take him down. And I just think that Ige, he's going to spend a lot of time either on his back or just working his way back up and not being able to get much of his offense off. So I think it's going to be real tough for Ige to really get anything off on Evloev. And, even if he was able to, I just don't think that Ige is a threatening enough fighter to do enough to either swing the rounds or be able to finish Evloev. Ige is a bit of a decisionator in my opinion. I know he's got a couple of knockouts at the UFC level, but overall, I don't think he's a big puncher, and I don't think he's a massive submission threat either. So I think that Evloev should be pretty safe to hit takedowns and get control time and just win the fight here. So yeah, I kind of like Evloev quite a bit in the spot. I think the line is kind of short right now at -255. I think that Evloev should be around like -400, honestly, which might seem kind of crazy to a lot of people. But, honestly, I think 20% indication for Ige, I think pretty accurate, just because I don't really see him knocking Evloev out. I think Evloev has fought better strikers and harder hitting strikers, and he was okay. And, I don't think that Ige is going to be able to submit Evloev either. And when it comes to the minute winning, I definitely have to favor Evloev. I think we see a typical, just a wrestling dominant performance from Evloev here. So I got to go with Evloev by unanimous decision. And I do think this fight goes to a decision here. Evloev, not a big finisher. Neither is Ige. I just see him, being able to hit a ton of takedowns and win on the scorecards here. And lastly, I'll just leave you guys with this. I think that the progression that Evloev has seen at the UFC level, I think is solid. He's not fighting like lower level guys. He's getting, an incremental increase in, difficulty when it comes to his opponents. He's been through a bit of adversity as well. We saw him get put through a very nasty choke by Grundy, was able to fight out of it and take over, second and third rounds. Put on a very dominant wrestling performance against a legit striker in Dawodu. So I think that, he's fought some good guys in there. He's looked really good doing it, and I think he continues to do it here against Ige. So give me Evloev, and give me Evloev by unanimous decision. And in the main event, we have Alexander Volkov versus Jairzinho Rozenstruik, and Volkov is the -160 favorite. Rozenstruik is the +140 underdog. And we'll start with the underdog in Rozenstruik first. So with Rozenstruik, I think we are somewhat familiar with this style. The guy is more of a counterpuncher. Historically he isn't someone who throws a lot of volume. Makes him, kind of inconsistent with his performances for those reasons. He's someone who will kind of just sit back and just wait for a big shot to land. Waiting for that opening to land. His big counter shot. But the guy does have good timing, and the guy is a very big hitter as well. Capable of, I think, knocking anyone out in the division. But I think the most infuriating thing about Rozenstruik is that I feel that when he's moving forward, he can actually have success. We saw that in the Sakai fight and the Overeem fight, where when he's actually moving forward and getting off on his offense, putting together combinations, he can actually create openings to land that big strike. But a lot of the time, he's just content to back up and let his opponent kind of dictate the pace and lead the dance. It's kind of worked for him, earlier in his career when maybe guys aren't as aware of his game plan, but now that there's more footage of him and, other fighters have seen him fight more, I think they're starting to be a little more better prepared for him. That said, though, he still is capable of just landing something big and putting you out. But he's going to be going up against Volkov, who, pretty high level, legit striker for the division. He's got a great frame and skill set for the division, but I think it's kind of apparent now where his ceiling is in the division. I think he's going to be a perennial, top 10, top 5 guy. But, he's going to struggle against just more well-rounded and more athletic heavyweights, right? Guys who maybe are a little quicker than him, a little more explosive, or guys who are able to take him down and hold him there. Because overall, Volkov, his game, he is mainly just a striker. He hasn't really shown too much outside of that. And where Volkov really has thrived is against just slower, more plotty heavyweights, where he's able to kind of just stay on the outside and pick him apart with his kicks. But Volkov, he is pretty good at managing distance. And again, he really does do a good job of, using the kicks to not only just do attritional work, work the body, work the lower legs, but also just maintain distance and just churn out consistent volume with it. And, as a tall, lankier fighter, he definitely uses that frame very well for the division. And taking a look at this matchup, though, I do think it's somewhat straightforward. Obviously, you kind of have to favor Volkov to be winning minutes here, but of course, Rozenstruik is capable of just landing a big shot to put him out. And, in a 5-round fight, I think that's a lot of time for Rozenstruik to land something big, and Rozenstruik has shown that he could carry that power late, which, why wouldn't it, right? The guy fights so conservatively. He's not expending a ton of energy, so you have to assume that, even in the 4th or 5th round, he's going to be able to land that kill shot. And obviously, we saw him do it in the Overeem fight. But, for this matchup, I think that, you kind of have to favor Volkov in general, just because the guy's going to be throwing way more volume. He's a very consistent minute winner, and just, I think, the more technical striker overall. So I got to go with Volkov in this spot. I think he should be able to go the distance here, stay safe, stay defensively sound, and just be able to pick Rozenstruik apart. Really just work the kicks from the outside and maybe look to clinch up with Rozenstruik when things do get a little wild. And overall, I do think that Volkov is pretty durable. He's been knocked out twice, once by Lewis, obviously, we all remember that, the late finish. And then once very early in his career against Minikov, who was able to land a very nice uppercut on him. But even then, he had to land like 15 other follow-up shots before getting the TKO stoppage. So, overall, I don't think Volkov is chinny or anything, not like Sakai at this point in his career. So I do think that Volkov, might be able to eat a few shots from Rozenstruik. Obviously, if Rozenstruik is landing clean, he'll probably put Volkov out, but I don't think Volkov is going to be going out easily, if that makes sense. And, like I was saying before, Volkov, he has shown that he can clinch up with opponents if they start getting a little wild, in the pocket. And, he actually has shown some nice trips as well in the clinch. So I do think that's something in the back pocket if things start to get hairy for him. Obviously, I don't think that it's going to be his main game plan, but I do think that Volkov, being the bigger and taller guy, he could probably, use the clinch a little bit. But overall, if things do get a little crazy for him, I think that's a bit of a safety valve for him. So I'm going to go with Volkov here. I think he likely just decisions Rozenstruik. I really don't see Rozenstruik winning a decision here. He'd have to drop Volkov, in 3 of the 5 rounds to win there. And if he does that, he probably gets the knockout. So if you like Rozenstruik, you probably take him by knockout. Volkov, he has been knocked out before. But I do think that this is a somewhat favorable matchup for Volkov. Rozenstruik's not really going to press the issue, and he's going to let Volkov set the pace. And, as long as Volkov, he doesn't get too wild or reckless in there, he should be able to outpoint Rozenstruik. So, I like Volkov to get it done by decision. Volkov, he does have a number of finishes, in his recent fights, but I don't think he's going to do anything crazy here. I think he's going to look to just stay safe and outpoint Rozenstruik. And Rozenstruik has historically been pretty tough, only been finished by Ngannou. So the pick is Volkov, and Volkov by decision. And that'll do it for this episode of the podcast. If you guys enjoyed the content, please hit the like and subscribe. Was really hoping to end the month on a W, but I guess we'll just have to wait till June to get our run started. We are on a bit of a cold streak right now. I think this past month and a half, it's been pretty rough, but I'm in it for the long haul here, and I'm pretty certain we'll bounce back and go on a nice little streak, and hopefully it'll be in this upcoming card here. We've had some bad bounces, but there were some bad reads mixed in as well. So looking to fine tune that a little bit and hopefully finish off the second half of this year with a nice little run. But anyways, I appreciate everyone for listening regardless. And I'll catch you guys in a couple of weeks for the UFC 275 breakdown.